Well, of course, ladies and gentlemen, you know everybody on the panel. Alan Jones is the nation's foremost broadcaster, a tribune of the people. He mixes a close and unusual interest in fields as diverse as politics, the arts, he's trod the boards, you know, and also, of course, sports. Quite remarkable. He launched a wonderful test for all sorts of government decisions years ago. That was derided, but now imitated, and that is, does it pass the pub test? Does it pass the pub test? I separately am trying to start a movement to constitutionalise that test so that that becomes the real test in Australia. During the referendum, all of the media, almost without exception, was in favour of the yes case, and quite often hysterically so, to the extent that sometimes if they didn't exclude us, they ridiculed us and pushed us in a corner. I remember, for example, there was a letter from 3 eminent knights on the front page of The Australian saying that the Republic was very safe. They were all knights of the realm, by the way. And then Ken drafted a response to that, and that was signed by 3 people of some of them, 2 of them of great eminence, and the other one was me. And it was published in a small column on page 9 of The Australian. That's the sort of thing that happened during that referendum. But there was one person, one of the prominent commentators, there was only one person who came out in favour of the no case, and that was Alan Jones. And he devised what became a wonderful slogan, because when people phoned him and said, "Not really sure about this Republic referendum, Alan," and his response, his eventual response always was, "If you don't know, vote no. If you don't know, vote no." And what a wonderful summary of the quandary that many people found themselves in about the Republic or about many other great matters. We also have on the platform Peter King. Peter King, not many people know this, or if they know it, will accept it. Peter King was the pioneer of the campaign which eventually defeated the Keating-Turnbull Republic. He did that as president of the Liberal Party. He set up a group of eminent people. It was going to be a committee of the Liberal Party, but it was soon realised you couldn't have just a committee of the Liberal Party. It had to be a broad church, so he swung it out and it became Australians for Constitutional Monarchy, and people like Michael Kirby and the former Labor Lord Mayor of Sydney were able to sit on that committee and play a significant role. He was, as you know, the federal member for Wentworth, but in 2004, after the biggest branch stack in the history of the nation, that seat was taken by another person who eventually took the seat and eventually became Prime Minister. He was formerly a judicial member of the Administrative Decisions Tribunal. He's the author of Limitation of Liability in Australian Maritime Law, and he wrote a commentary on climate policy, The Challenge of the Commons, in 2015. He's appeared, often pro bono, that is, not paid. He's appeared in the highest courts in the land in a number of leading cases, in cases for farmers against banks and a soldier who was dismissed. He argued improperly. And he has also appeared in cases concerning the present crisis, in which we wonder whether there is an excess of power and an absence of the usual checks and balances. The other member of the panel was going to be, and still is, I suppose, in more ways than one, Tony Abbott, former Prime Minister of Australia. He's a living example of what we're talking about in this session. That is, the disappearance of checks and balances on power which were once considered normal, which applied in peacetime and applied in emergencies, even in war. Ken has written an excellent opinion on this, to which you were referred. It's on the front page of our website. And in summary, it's the two very important sets of checks and balances on the exercise of executive power, that is delegated legislation under existing Acts of Parliament, seem to have disappeared. And that is, when you exercise delegated legislation, for example, under the Public Health Act, once upon a time, or under any act, anything of significance, would have gone to the Executive Council. If you look at the Constitution, the executive power is exercised by the Governor-General. You expect that important exercises of executive power be by the Governor-General and the Governor. It's not that the Governor and the Governor-General actually decide these issues. This is a constitutional monarchy. The Governor-General acts on advice. But there are certain ways in which that should be properly done. There's a process there consistent with democracy, because we can't have premiers, we can't have prime ministers acting as dictators, acting on whims. They have to be subject to checks and balances. As the great Lord Acton famously said, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So in Australia we had accepted conventions. They may not form part of the formal constitution, but there were ways in which things were done. If you issued an important order, regulations, decisions, under the Public Health Act, it would go to the Executive Council. Sir Guy Green, a great governor who'd been Chief Justice of his state, Sir Guy Green, in the Menzies Oration, which you can find if you Google that, he said that this is what should happen. First, there should be a precise statement of what the ministers are asking the governor to do, a very precise statement, setting it out. And secondly, it should state the power which the governor has to do that, because that is not always evident, that there is power to do what is being proposed. We saw in New South Wales, for example, during the crisis, an order was made which closed down the building industry for 2 weeks. It cost $1.4 billion. $1.4 billion. The chief medical officer said she didn't give health advice to do that, but that was done. So going back to Sir Guy Green, a precise statement of what to do. What's the power to do that? And Peter King will tell us that there are restrictions on that power. That's been shown in the recent case in the federal court concerning the live cattle ban. The federal court has found that the exercise of delegated authority by the minister, not through the Executive Council, by the minister, went beyond his powers in the legislation. And he's made a massive, or going to make a massive, award of damages in the live cattle ban case. That minister had 2 orders before him drafted in his office. And remember, there was a lot of concern expressed on the ABC over what was happening to some of the cattle in Indonesia. But we knew there were safe abattoirs in Indonesia. The first order that Minister Ludwig made was to ban the export of cattle except to the safe abattoirs. There was an exception for the safe abattoirs. He had another order which he then issued a couple of days later, no doubt because of press pressure, media pressure. The second was to completely ban the whole live cattle export industry, which did enormous damage to people all over, particularly in Queensland, Indigenous people, non-Indigenous, large numbers of people suffered terribly. The damages bill, though, won't be paid by Minister Ludwig. The damages bill won't be paid by the then government. You will pay. The taxpayers will pay that damage. So going back to what Sir Guy Green said, firstly, precise statement. Secondly, what power do you have? And just on power, let me make a comment. Although we have a panel here, I shouldn't be taking their role. But we've been prohibited from going overseas unless we fall into certain exceptions. If you look at the federal legislation, it seems to give a power to the minister to block people going overseas so that they don't transmit the disease when they go overseas. It's not a blanket power. It's a power only to stop people transmitting the disease when they go overseas. The obvious thing to do was for the minister to say, you have to be tested. He could even say you have to be vaccinated. But certainly anybody else should have been able to go overseas. Obviously, coming back, they should be subject to restrictions. But in my opinion, humble of course, in my opinion, the minister has gone too far. That is beyond power, that order that he made. If you follow the decision in the live cattle ban case, if you follow what Sir Guy Green is saying is the proper exercise of the power. And then Sir Guy says in that Menzies oration, it's well worth reading, it's a very good oration. He then says, the advice to the Governor or the Governor-General has to also indicate whether there are any conditions on the exercise of the power, as there usually are in legislation, and whether those conditions have been fulfilled. So what the Governor-General does is audit the process. The Governor doesn't make a decision, but they make sure all the I's are dotted, all the T's crossed. That's the first great check and balance, which disappeared completely. It was there in wartime, disappeared completely in relation to the current crisis. The other great check and balance was that once the order, whatever it was, whatever it's called, was made by the Governor or the Governor-General, it would then be tabled in Parliament. And either House could subject to that to whatever scrutiny it wanted. They could call for papers, they could subpoena documents, they might not be successful, but they had the ultimate power. Either House could disallow the legislation, disallow the order. An enormous power. That's why Queensland must reverse the theft of their upper house by the politicians 100 years ago. People voted to keep the upper house. The politicians then, a couple of years later, got rid of the upper house. You need an upper house. They say it's cost. If it's cost, don't pay them anything. Politicians might not be happy with that. Just have a small upper house of unpaid politicians. Well, that's the question which we're asking. We've reached a situation where we've effectively made 7 people a cabal of dictators. The Prime Minister has chosen to underwrite financially the decisions of the premiers, and what Ken says in his opinion, Ken Handley says in his opinion, is ACM can take no position as an organisation on the quality, on the correctness of decisions taken. We're only looking at the process. And he suggests that when the dust settles after this crisis, there ought to be a meeting of minds over restoring what are normal checks and balances. So I now ask the panel to express their views on this. Perhaps, Alan, you have a view.
Thank you, David. Goodness me. I would suggest that on many issues of major importance, there are virtually none. I just thought I wanted to share with you today, for example, I mean, we have just seen, in terms of checks and balances, the greatest denial of freedoms in our history. And they're still at work today. I see people are wearing masks here today. There is no epidemiological justification for the wearing of masks. These are just mandated with, as David has just said, there's no discussion. And if you take the overview, I just ran off today, which I have got into trouble for doing for the last 18 months. We're a population of 25.5 million people, nearly 26 million people. If you look at today's figures here, the number of coronavirus cases since way back in February, 217,000. If you take 217,000 out of 25.5 million people, you get about 0.005%. We're a pretty healthy country. We've intimidated people through hysteria and alarmism into believing that all you have to do really is to go out and get a box of nails and a hammer and some pine boards and build yourself a coffin and you're about to depart. When in fact there are the stats. This is not Alan Jones, the World Health Organisation. The number of mild cases in Australia today is 99.6%. The number of mild cases in the world today, read all the alarmist figures, 99.6%. Those figures have been consistent for the last any number of months, 17 months. Now, I cited regularly, when you're talking about, advice, at least Sergeant Jarvid, the British Health Minister, said, yes, I get advice, but I make the decisions. And sometimes this advice is biased in the wrong direction, and we'll determine all of this. The classic example, of course, is in Victoria, when you talk about these people have set a world record down there. The last lockdown occurred when there were 6 cases in Melbourne. It lasted for 7 weeks. When Andrews believed he was running out of political capital, the lockdowns were removed, Freedom Day arrived, and there were 2,000 cases. There are today 1,800 cases, but there are the figures, 99.6% are mild. Now, a chap by the name of Professor Kuldov, who is and another Professor Gupta, are eminent epidemiologists from Oxford in the world. Sunetra Gupta is a woman who said right at the outset she had difficulty getting anyone to listen to what she had to say because she argued there was no epidemiological validity in lockdowns. Now, David's point is this matter should have been, before we start any of this, gone back to the People's Chamber, the Parliament, to be debated, for these views to be presented as professional and scholarly advice. Another of these eminent people was a Professor Bhattacharya from Stanford University. Said we have open scientific debate to correct one another. That's fallen away in the service of this idea that as a scientific community we should convey a single message. So we get the entire public to do the set of things we want them to do. That is an error, and it's poisoned scientific debate. None of these views were allowed. Indeed, as a broadcaster, I was severely sanctioned for even arguing these positions. Now, the most eminent current epidemiologist in the world is Professor John Ioannidis from Stanford University. And John Ioannidis says, in the middle of last year, in a long dissertation, and let's read you a bit of it. If we'd not known about a new virus out there and had not checked individuals with PCR tests, now as you know, these people queue up forever when they don't even feel ill. And this is all, Morrison tells us, of course, this is free. Now, as we had with the live meat exports, not free, you pay. No one will tell us what the pharmaceutical companies are getting out of this. So then there was the first to test free, vaccine free, none of them free. Now, of course, Big Pharma can just see that this is a this is a gravy train, which is not going to be uncoupled. So now we're going to have boosters, which will be free. And the cost is billions and billions of dollars. John Ioannidis said, if we'd not known about a new virus and had not checked individuals with PCR tests, the number of total deaths due to, quote, influenza-like illness would not seem unusual this year. At most, we might have casually noted that the flu season seems to be a bit worse than average. The media coverage would have been less than for an NBA game between two of the most indifferent teams. John Ioannidis. He said one can only hope, one of the bottom lines is that we don't know how long social distancing measures and lockdowns can be maintained without major consequences to the economy, society and mental health. We've already got that, all of them, together. He said, one can only hope that much like in 1918, life will continue. Well, it didn't. No one shut down in 1918. They didn't close the parliament during the war. He said, conversely, with lockdowns of months, if not years, life largely stops. Short-term and long-term consequences are entirely unknown, and billions, not just millions of lives, will eventually be at stake. He said, Ioannidis, if we decide to jump off the cliff, we need some data to inform us about the rationale of such an action and the chances of landing somewhere safe. Now, I won't take your time, but I've got pages of these people from world authorities, all saying the same thing. Dr. Sukarat Bhakti, a microbiologist and infectious disease epidemiologist from Mainz University in Germany. All these measures are leading to self-destruction and collective suicide based on nothing but a spook. Now, when we're talking about accountability and checks and balances, the public are entitled to all opinions, especially those of eminent authorities. Dr. Joel Kettner, the Professor of Community Health Sciences and Surgery at Manitoba University, I've seen pandemics, he said, one every year. It's called influenza and other respiratory illness viruses. I've never seen this reaction, and I'm trying to understand why. Dr. Joran Laas, who's the Director General of the Israel Health Ministry, we all forget the swine flu in 2009. Now, if you ask people out in the streets now, do they remember the swine flu? They wouldn't. But the swine flu actually killed as many people in the first 12 months as did this coronavirus. We have 471 deaths in Australia every day. Every day. But the alarmism continued. He said, we all forget the swine flu. That was a virus that reached the world from Mexico, and until today there's no vaccination against it. At the time there was no Facebook. The coronavirus, in contrast, is a virus with public relations. Whoever could think that the government would end viruses, and they're wrong. So look, you could go on further. That's my first point, and I'll give Peter some time here, but there has been no check, no accountability, no nothing, and I'm sorry, who's to blame? We are. Why do we cop all this? Now, they realise they're in trouble now because all these protests in the street are not about anti-vaxxers. I spoke at a function last week in Echuca, down near the border. I've never seen such wealth. I sat at a gala dinner, all right, I spoke at this dinner, and the bloke sitting beside me was a pig farmer. Now, I can give you 2 free trips around the world for the rest of your life, and you won't be able to tell me Peter King, and he's a farmer's son. How many pigs this bloke had? He was a pig farmer. 90,000. 90,000 pigs. And a bloke wanted to see me on Saturday night because he said, I'm banned from the dinner because I'm not double vaxxed. I'm not double vaxxed, I'm banned from the dinner. He said, I've been vaxxed since I was 2. He owns 45 dairy farms, this bloke. I've had vax since I was 2, but I'm not having double vax. I'm not being double vaxxed because I object to being ordered. Now, this is precisely the theme of today as to what on earth is the Parliament for, what on earth do we go to elections for, when we've now got a national cabinet which has no constitutional status. We've closed down parliaments. We don't defend the Constitution. The borders are locked down. People don't know whether they can get to Queensland. That fool in WA says, well, that'll happen next March or something. So they're playing politics. We are in a diabolical mess in this country, and there's no one in an elected position prepared to argue the validity of that case. I could go on forever, as you know. Peter deserves a turn.
Peter, thank you, Alan. That was absolutely superb. Peter, you would be an expert on what we can do under the law at the moment and whether these actions of various executive governments are within power.
Well, can I
Notwithstanding what Justice Beech-Jones thinks.
Yeah, can I say that Alan has actually put the issues very well, not just from a practical point of view, but also from a legal point of view. But I'll come back to that in a minute. But firstly, I look around the room and see a number of people here that I know very well, and thank you for coming and listening to us. It's a great pleasure to see so many old friends, and I look forward to having a chat or a cup of tea with you later. I'm only sorry, David, that three other great leaders of this movement, Kerry Jones, Lloyd Waddy and Tony Abbott, are not here. But can I say this, that with the likes of those people and the people in this room, it seems to me that the ACM movement will continue to be a formidable presence in the Australian community well into the future. And woe betide the Fitzsimons of this world if they try and upset our constitutional arrangement. I mention that because I want to start by referring to a book that written by, or edited by a guy called Jake Thrupp. Alan has made a contribution in this book, and so have I. Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that.
Brilliant young man, 23.
And my small contribution was talking about the enduring Australian Constitution, and it's ultimately, though, as you know, David, it's the people in this room who make an institution, infrastructure endure, and it's meetings such as this that has the effect of cementing our resolve into the future to ensure that wonderful constitution that we all share and enjoy and live under remains as it is. I want to talk about emergency laws, and in particular the public health laws at the moment that Alan's so eloquently spoken about and exposed, in my view, the real issues. It is true there is in section 51(23) capital A of our Constitution, put in as a result of one of the few referenda to pass since 1901. This referenda passed in 1946 during the years of the very fashionable welfare state. And 23 capital A provides, amongst other things, that the Commonwealth shall have power to make laws for the peace, order and good government with respect to medical and dental services, but not so as to authorise any form of civil conscription. And Alan talked about the pig farmer and the freedom of choice. But it seems to me that one of the fallacies in the current legislative programs, certainly in New South Wales, has been to assume that legislation that was made in 1991, 2010, but not specifically for this particular so-called pandemic, is sufficient to warrant or justify the exercise of power that our Minister Brad Hazzard has done. And in thinking about the points that I wanted to raise today, I wanted to reiterate how comforting it is to know that in our constitutional foundation we have three great documents. Not just the Australian Constitution, which is discussed in Jake's book, but behind it, centering and giving balance to the Australian Constitution, is the Bill of Rights back in 1688. And I mention that because of its current relevance, because that Bill of Rights focuses on the importance of pathways. That is to say, that if ministers of the Crown wish to exercise a power, they have to find the source of it. If it's not in a royal prerogative, and none of these are, it must be sourced to some legislation. Now we have over here Ken Handley, who's probably the nation's leading expert on construing acts of parliament and legislation. So I don't want to be too strong in my views about these issues.
Go ahead.
But well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because in the Court of Appeal last week, an issue arose where I was able to cite Ken Handley's judgment in a case you'll have forgotten, Ken, called Kelly and said that. But it involved this whole question of pathways back to the Bill of Rights. Because the problem under the Bill of Rights was that King James was exercising power without regard to the Parliament. And so there was a battle between the Crown and the Parliament, which Parliament ultimately won. But written into the Bill of Rights was an absolute requirement that if ministers of the Crown or the executive or the bureaucracy, who are really running this national pandemic public health program at the moment, then they must be accountable. They must apply laws that have been passed. They can't invent or create processes which are not authorised by the people. And applying Ken's judgment in the Court of Appeal, who are now chewing over your judgment, Ken, we'll find out what they think about it perhaps next week, was this point, that Brad Hazzard was purporting to exercise a power under Section 7, subsection 3 of the Public Health Act, New South Wales, which in fact hadn't been properly activated or exercised, which he admitted was the case. There's supposed to be a requirement under this legislation that if the minister wants to exercise powers over in relation to directing people what to do in a health situation, lockdown laws in particular, then he must firstly make a declaration that there is a public health risk in a specific public health risk area. He did none of those things. The public service and the minister just carried on as if those requirements, specific ground rules to ensure that any directions he made to the people of New South Wales were specific to a particular area. Nothing like that happened. And we end up with a situation that Alan's describing, where we get Dr. Kerry Chant and others speaking in generalisms about the problems and the risks in New South Wales, instead of focusing on the real risks to specific areas for specific people. And when you do that, you realise how few people in fact are at risk. And then the failure to implement this law in accordance with the Bill of Rights, 1688, Alan, has led to so much unhappiness, disruption and concern in the broader community. In Melbourne, last weekend, there was 500,000 people demonstrating on the streets about this issue. In Sydney, it was 10,000 people, not so many, but it was I attended for a short while. It was a very peaceable rally, very, very well run. The speakers were of an excellent and high standard. I then had to go off and prepare my Court of Appeal diatribe. But that's the first point, that our constitutional foundation and the freedoms that we enjoy must be preserved by people in this room who are concerned to ensure that those fundamentals are maintained and put in place. The other area that I wanted to, or the other foundational document that I wanted to mention finally is the Magna Carta. Now, of course, real lawyers, when they hear the phrase Magna Carta, go to sleep because they think this is just a diatribe about an utterly irrelevant old document. But there is one phrase in Magna Carta which rings true, I'm sure Ken Handley will agree today: due process of law. Because the battle between King John and the people back in those times was about equality before the law and access to the courts. And that battle was won a long time ago, but it's still important. And another criticism of the current health laws in New South Wales, or the current health directions, is that due process wasn't followed by the bureaucracy in setting up the directions that are currently made. Order number 2, and it's now called the General Order. And in particular, they treated these rules as if they were a legislative power conferred on the minister and the executive itself. But it's absolutely clear that if you follow the idea of due process, all that's conferred on the minister is administrative powers, a much less or reduced scope of power in the minister himself. And they sidelined the Minister for Security, for State Emergency Rescue Management, the Honourable Anthony Roberts, who should have been the person running the COVID campaign in New South Wales, by making a declaration of emergency, if that was appropriate. It's strange indeed, Alan, that in New South Wales, an emergency was declared during the bushfire crisis in 2019, but none for the so-called pandemic in 2020 and 2021. It is true in Victoria they did it, but why not in New South Wales? And why take this other pathway, this wrong pathway, to the administration of our public health laws in a way that's going to be, well, has proved so distressing to so many people? Well, that's all I have to contribute to this debate, David. We can say that if the Court of Appeal, who are currently looking at this issue at the moment, don't like these arguments, we think that the High Court will be the appropriate forum. At the same time, I'm doing another case in the full court of the Supreme Court of Tasmania, where the same issues have arisen, but in particular for a group of doctors, 1,800 doctors in Tasmania, decided that they didn't wish to be jibby-jabbed, as it's called by one of my experts, and they were then sacked.
True.
The leading surgeon in the Royal Hobart Hospital, with 200 students and 200 nurses in his charge,
Shameful.
and 1,800 medicos all told. There hasn't been one case in Tasmania for 2 years. What are we talking about?
And government interfering in the confidential relationship between the doctor and the patient.
Absolutely. This is so. The point Alan's making now is absolutely critical, and that's why this protection in the Constitution, put in there by Sir Robert Menzies, because the Labor Party put up the referendum, and Menzies said, "I'll only support it if you have in there the words, except by any form of civil conscription."
Which is mandatory.
Mandatory. And I think that governments, and more particularly bureaucracies and ministers, have overlooked these very special, important limitations. And the reason is that there hasn't, just let me finish on this point, Alan mentioned Parliament. There's a wonderful gentleman sitting, or was sitting, on the House of Lords, no longer the House of Lords, now the Supreme Court of Judicature, I think, isn't it, John? Yes. Thank you. Our leading English law expert here, John Armfield. Lord Hoffman, originally a South African, but a great lawyer. And Lord Hoffman said, what is absolutely critical in these situations where fundamental common law rights, such as the right to bodily integrity, such as the right of freedom of choice, are being curtailed by Parliament, unless there is a specific law to authorise such a curtailment, it should not happen. The Parliament must go back and debate the point again. That has not happened in New South Wales. That has not happened in the Commonwealth.
No.
That has not happened in Tasmania. It happened recently, in the last 2 weeks in Victoria, and there was uproar. And Dan, and Dan, I suspect, Alan, as a result of that public debate, which is the first time they've had it after the whole crisis is over, may well lose the next election on the basis of it.
Yes, you see, what I have never been able to get my head around, look, I'm sorry, I'm being a bit blunt here, but we're being run by pretty ordinary people with very limited scholarship, no capacity to read, and they just tailor themselves to those people who tell them what to hear. Now, Professor David Katz is the founding director of the Yale University Prevention Research Centre. I think you might know a bit more than Kerry Chant or Dr. Jeanette Young or Gladys Berejiklian. I am deeply concerned. All of this has now come to pass. Everything he warned against has come to pass. I'm now deeply concerned that the social, economic and public health consequences. Now, he didn't make these comments yesterday. He was warning about this last July when everyone was going nuts. I'm deeply concerned the social, economic and public health consequences of this near total meltdown of normal life will have long-lasting and calamitous consequences, possibly graver than the direct toll of the virus itself. The unemployment, impoverishment and despair likely to result will be the public health scourges of the first order. Now, that has all come to pass. None of this was allowed to be said. And so there's Therapeutic Goods Administration. People like me, for example, I get 3 legal letters a day for my program. At least three legal letters. You can't say this, you can't, which is the reason I didn't sign with them. You can't say this and you can't say that and you can't say something else. Now, none of these views, let alone were given any currency, they were completely ignored. Dr. Peter Goetsche is the Professor of Clinical Research, Design and Analysis at the University of Copenhagen. Our main problem is no one will ever get into trouble for measures that are too draconian. They'll only get into trouble if they do too little. Remember the joke about tigers? Why did you blow that horn? To keep the tigers away. But there are no tigers. There, you see? And that's precisely. So the Morrisons of this world have told us we saved 30,000 lives. We saved 50,000 lives, elect me, because we handled this coronavirus. And the level of business and individual impoverishment, to deny kids the opportunity of going to school in the most formative period of their life is something about which we'll never ever, until 10 or 12 years' time, be able to estimate the damage that's been done. All because none of this was subject to your words, checks and balances, no accountability, no public debate, Parliament doesn't meet. Anyone with a different or dissident view was cancelled, and hence the old cancel culture emerged. So we're in it. We're not out of the woods here. We're deeper into the woods than we've ever been.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Peter. This program is being recorded because the conference was on and off and we had to move from Parliament to here. And people are in difficulties at the moment. It's a time of the year when people don't want to come to conferences. It will nevertheless be put on Facebook and YouTube, and we have quite a reach there. We had a post recently which reached 200,000 people. Nothing like the sort of reach that Alan has on his Facebook, but it was something interesting. We have another speaker. Oh yeah, much better than the ARM. We had another speaker, but that's Tony Abbott. But as I've mentioned, he is a victim of precisely what we're talking about, because he was overseas, he came back, he would have been able to come here, but suddenly, because of a mild variant, they changed the quarantine laws, and he's locked up at home and can't come here. He has a background which is most unusual for politicians these days. He had a life outside of politics. He didn't go straight from the university to the ministerial office to the safe seat. He had a completely different life, probably why he is one of the nation's most principled politicians. And as you know, he had a superb presence at Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar and he won a blue in boxing.
So
He
was
was-
Peter King, by the way, Rhodes Scholar.
There we are, yes. And probably his starring role in life was, of course, Executive Director of Australians for Constitutional Monarchy. And it's relevant to recall about Tony that he was a superb Minister for Health. He built up a plan for the sort of
He did.
pandemic that we have, and he was praised internationally for that.
Yep.
They filed it away and didn't follow it.
Yes, that's correct.
But he would have been, had he been on this ridiculous national cabinet, he would have been an influence for taking sensible decisions. So the work of the plotters who removed him from the prime ministership visited a national disaster on the country, another national disaster. But when I spoke to him yesterday about this, he offered to participate in the conference, and he said, as no other politician normally would, he said, I'll write you a piece. And he's written a paper for me to read to you. I can't read it as well as Tony would. I can't give it the same meaning that he would, but I'll read it to you now, if I may, by your leave. I'm sorry that I can't be here today in person due to the recent Omicron quarantine rules. It's good that you're here, though, to support the Crown in our Constitution and to show your support for the best possible Australia. It frustrates me, as I'm sure it sometimes frustrates you, that over the past 20 months our normal freedoms have been so much interrupted. This pandemic has been a serious threat to life and health, but it's possible to overreact even to serious challenges. To me, we've spent too much and we've restricted too much. And in the process of maximising safety collectively, we've minimised freedom. Yet isn't the whole point of life to make the most of it every day and to take risks when you think they're justified? One of the worst aspects of this pandemic has been the deference of elected and accountable politicians to unelected and unaccountable officials. For quite a while now, there's been too much deference to so-called expert advice. But the pandemic has made this democratic deficit much, much worse. Prime ministers and premiers have to take the experts seriously, but in the end, it's the politicians who are elected to govern, not the bureaucrats. And it's the politicians who will bear responsibility for the decisions the experts have driven. At every level, the rules have been made by diktat, with very little democratic accountability. For instance, I'm not aware of any debate in any Australian parliament about the necessity for unprecedented restrictions on the basic freedoms: to go to work, to leave home, to cross borders, and to visit loved ones that we have previously been able to take for granted. Even though the experts and the science has differed from time to time and from state to state, maybe the restrictions really were necessary. Even so, there should have been much more opportunity for parliamentary debate and for party room questioning, if only to keep grounded the ministers and the officials promulgating them. Yes, it looks like we've got through the worst of the pandemic with fewer deaths and less economic damage than many other countries. Let me note there my own words. A lot of this is not because of the politicians. It's because we're a remote
We're an
island
island state.
nation. I think we should remember that. But that doesn't mean that there haven't been mistakes made and lessons to be learned, and that we can dispense with the need for a National Royal Commission thoroughly to consider what's gone right and what's gone wrong in the light of all the evidence here and overseas. Why, for instance, in Victoria, should the Premier be able to declare a pandemic, after which the Health Minister can make any rules whatsoever, provided he thinks they're reasonably necessary for the protection of public health, without any effective accountability mechanisms? Are the times really so desperate that we need an elective health dictatorship, even though there's much we can be grateful for over the past 20 months? And Liberal governments, I'm happy to say, have been generally less authoritarian, from the states especially. There's also been panicky overreaction, official high-handedness, and an abundance of rules, sometimes oppressive and sometimes administered differently, depending on whether those affected are sports stars or ordinary citizens. In the main, though it has to be said, this has been a question of leadership, a function of the particular personnel in government at the time, and deficiencies in legislation as it currently operates, not any failure in our system of government itself. As always, the main means for being better governed is to elect a better government. Certainly, it's not the monarchy that is in any way to blame for the errors of these times. As I've often said, there's nothing wrong with Australia that becoming a republic would improve, and much right that becoming a republic would imperil. Thanks again for your support here in Australia. To paraphrase Churchill, constitutional monarchy is the worst possible system, except for all the others that have sometimes been tried. Have a good conference. I shall report that questioning. Now, two young members, young ambassadors of Australia to constitutional monarchy would ask...
Yes. Point. The politicians have said they're relying on the experts, but these health bureaucrats are not experts.
Correct.
They're generalists. They haven't been in medical practice for years. They've been running a department. The experts have been referred to by Alan Jones, ignored. No one's drawn those attention to the politicians when they're making the decisions. You just relied upon non-expert bureaucrats.
Well, Jeanette Young was the registrar at Rockhampton Hospital. That means they give out gloves and pens and pencils and check people in and so on. And decided to move to Queensland and, as I understand it, lived in a house 2 doors up from Peter Beattie and became Heather Beattie's doctor. Now, in those days, no one thought anything about a chief. I don't think people knew there was a chief medical officer. They had nothing to do. Mind you, she's on $600,000 a year. And now, in a unicameral legislature, Peter, she is the governor with no expertise whatever. So anything that they want can be passed through. But just to finalise, I don't want to bore you here, but to make another point that Ken talked about the experts. Now, Professor, there's a stack of them here, and this is a Professor Kuldorf, a Kuldorf. Now, this bloke is the Harvard University Professor of Medicine, so he'd know nothing. Know nothing. And I venture to say that Berejiklian and Andrews and Palaszczuk and Morrison have never heard of him. He said children and young adults, this is in the middle of all of this when they're talking about keeping kids out of school and so on, children and young adults should be able to live life normally. They should wash their hands and those kinds of things. But there is no public health reason to close schools. I think these sorts of general lockdowns of closing schools, closing restaurants, closing beaches have a detrimental effect on public health. I mean, there's pages of these people all over the world. Now, I recently have lived at St Vincent's Hospital, unfortunately. That's sort of more medical procedures than I could do with. Without exception, they say none of us here have been consulted on any of this, and none of us approve of anything that's happened in terms of expert medical outcomes. And yet even today, people are paralysed with fear, and kids are being indoctrinated in schools about all of this. There's no education, it's indoctrination. And given that the people of tomorrow are not us, they're the kids at schools, and to just deviate a little from the themes that are on here today, for example, they say, well, kids can't spell and can't punctuate, so we'll now go back to phonics teaching, the teaching of phonics, sound, to determine how we spell. Well, that's all very well, but the teachers in the classroom have no knowledge of phonics. So we've perpetuated a system of education which is almost impossible to eradicate, because it's all very well to make high-minded arguments about how we're going to teach spelling and reading in schools, but if the people at the classroom have been taught under the system that was completely flawed, the kids have got no hope. And this is a betrayal. So you've got children in school today, they can't cite a verse of poetry, they don't know the difference between an apostrophe and a full stop, they don't know what a sentence is. And I'm telling you, I appointed a 19-year-old, he started work this week, terrific kid, and I always put them to the test. I said, Angus, just take this down, would you? He takes it down, give it back to me, forget it. There's no full stops, there's no nothing, he doesn't know where they go. So we're facing a whole heap, and this is all about what David has been saying about accountability. I mean, who holds these people to the test on any issue, not just health, but on education, on transport, on the whole kit and caboodle. And there's an arrogance there which is breathtaking. And yet many of these people you wouldn't give a job to, and you certainly wouldn't make them Deputy Mayor of Hurstville Council. And they're running, these people are running the nation. And as the problems mount, I mean, those polls are out today. I just put a thing on my Facebook page. I mean, they say, oh, there's 36% of people support the Liberal Party. No, 64% don't. 38% are supporting Labor. No. 62%. The public don't want any of them. So they feel impotent. They know there's a problem. They don't like the Australia that we're coming to tomorrow. And again, you know, when I spoke of this, it was the gala dinner it was to raise money for childcare. They paid a lot of dough. It was brilliantly done. You couldn't have done it at the Ritz. But I opened by saying there were 250 people in the room, and I said, listen, I'm going to ask a question here, and I'll speak slowly. Put your hand up in the room if there's any person here tonight who isn't frightened of saying what they really believe. I said to them, I'll say it again, put your hand up if there's a person who isn't frightened of saying what you're, not one hand went up. So we're in the world of self-censure now. People are frightened to speak, absolutely intimidated of speaking out. And they preface it saying, look, I know I shouldn't say this. Hang on, you're perfectly, but debate is dead. The exchange of different viewpoints is over. On healthcare, we have to toe the line. This is it, and this will happen. You'll be vaccinated, or else you're a second-class citizen. We've reached, as I said, a very serious point, I think, in the nation's development.
During the early part of the crisis, I live at Bondi, near the beach, and I heard screaming, obviously with a megaphone. Couldn't work out what it was. I went out on my balcony, and I saw a woman screaming through her megaphone to a boy well out at sea on a surfboard, screaming and ordering him to come back because of the virus. And I thought, what on earth did she think he would catch out on the seas?
Perfectly healthy.
Perfectly healthy, alone on his surfboard, and she ordered him to come back.
Well, we brought the military in. We had people in the streets with guns. The people come to this Australia to escape that kind of environment and wake up with people marching down the streets, and no one's got the brains to understand if your policy is so crooked that you need the Defence Force and armed police to implement the policy, there might be something wrong with the policy.
Now, thank you, Alan. Our young ambassadors want to ask a couple of other questions relating to the issue of changing the Constitution. The first is from Daniel Lahoud.
Thank you. Absolutely honoured to ask this question to three extraordinary men. So I understand that the no case in the 1999 referendum was so successful. The first draft was written by Australians for Constitutional Monarchists, Professor David Flynn, who was asked by Kerry Jones at the time. The Republicans have been trying to neutralise it in any further referendum. When Tony Abbott was in opposition, the Rudd government stopped it being sent out to every elector. It now goes to every household, which is addressed as to the housekeeper. We call that the garbage tin amendment because that is where it is placed. Too often it ends up in the garbage tin, as they have intended it to be. They have tried to reduce its size, have it ridden by a so-called independent commission. They even tried to weight the funding so that the proposed local government referendum, the yes case, was to receive $10 million and the no case only $500,000. As one of ACM's team who appeared before a recent parliamentary inquiry on referendums, I have two questions. First, changing the constitution is very important. Surely all Australians are entitled to their own copy of the yes/no booklet. And secondly, it shocks me as a young Australian that Republicans will try to obviously rig the vote. What should we do about this?
Well, what should we do about it? I would think the answer to that, my answer would be to have great faith in the common sense of the Australian people. And I don't think, yes, I agree about the distribution of the booklet, but I think there'll be enough people in the public place to prosecute the argument that I think Professor Flint made half an hour ago, that there are no discernible benefits from changing what we really enjoy. We have a massive migrant population and people queuing up at the borders because of the kind of country we are. And that's the greatest vote of confidence you can have in the system of government we've got. And the golden rule is leave well alone. And of course, come back to we've always got to come back to the original argument. They cannot identify if they want a president or whatever the hell they want. I don't know what they want. If they want it, they can not define how that person is going to reach that office. They're going to be elected, they're going to have more power than the Prime Minister, or it's going to be elected by the Parliament. They don't know, and that's why I argue if you don't know, vote no. Look, I think that this whole referendum thing, I hope Peter Fitzsimons stays in charge, because the longer he's there, the worse the campaign looks. And he's our greatest asset. But look, I think it's John Howard always talked about the good sense, and I think the good sense will prevail. We've got enough dislocation in this country today without introducing further dislocation in terms of the way in which we govern ourselves.
Just to add to that, David, it may have been you or Kerry or Lloyd, I don't know, but the saying that was out in the community during that referendum, say no to the politicians' republic, was a very powerful message. And I think it struck home with a lot of ordinary people. Certainly I saw a lot of notices and signs on refrigerators in different houses that I went to. As to the requirement there is no requirement to send out memoranda, but generally speaking, governments, if they're sensible, will fund an information booklet, and hopefully that will fairly set out the case for both sides.
That statement, that motto, "Say no to the politicians' republic," came from Rick Brown. He was a DLP man. He became our director in Victoria. Very good man, very close to Santa Maria. Yeah. But he was probably the best advisor about politics. And the one state we thought we might lose particularly was Victoria. And because of his advice, we won even Victoria.
Can I say this? The fact that the Republicans want to reduce the funding for the no case and reduce the distribution of the booklet demonstrates they're scared of the people.
Yes.
That's right. Correct.
No.
And that's our point. They try this on, you're scared of the people.
Now, young Ambassador Will Jeffries would like to pose a question.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you, Mr. Jones and Ken and Mr. King, of course,
Charles
for
is a very good lawyer.
all your, he sure is, and all your contributions to this country. Now, I have a question that was suggested by the Professor, but first I'd like to ask one I couldn't help but ask. We see what's happening in this country. Daniel Andrews giving total control to his health minister, the worst public transport procurement program in Australian history in the New South Wales government with our friend Andrew Constance, Anastasia Palaszczuk, responsible for the death of a man at the Queensland border near Stanthorpe the other day, and of course an unborn child who wanted to go from Ballina up to Gold Coast for an essential hospital. Just today in Queensland as well, we've seen that if you want a heart transplant and you're not fully vaccinated, you can't get that heart transplant. Mr. Mal Gowan over in Western Australia is splitting up families during Christmas. The federal government has done nothing about the deindustrialisation of this nation. We're responsible for 70% of the world's seaborne steel-making supplies, coke and coal, iron ore, and yet we produce 0.3% of the world's steel, less than the Egyptians and the Dutch. We're shutting down our coal-fired power plants. Our manufacturing output has now decreased for the first time in history, and that's in real terms, not in growth terms. At what stage does the governor or the Governor-General step in and do something about this out-of-touch political elite, which, as you said, Ken, are generalists, they're not experts. They start at university, I know many of them myself, they're straight through the Young Liberals into a safe seat after working as an advisor. These are not people I want to entrust with the future of my country. And as to the second question, we all know what the Republicans are like, especially Mr Fitzsimmons and co. I'm just wondering, what are we going to do about the fact they're now putting in the head of state in the polls and in the questions? Mr Turnbull is a big proponent of this. Whenever, in 1987, we saw what happened with Sir Ninian Stephen, the Indonesians, because of a Republican, obviously, at the Australian Embassy, I suspect, in Jakarta. He refused to acknowledge the Governor-General, and later on they apologised. In 1907, the High Court as well, they were very involved in the drafting of the Constitution, and they came to the conclusion that the Governor-General is the head of state. So what are we going to do about these pesky Republicans who want to undermine our cause by putting in those three words which confuse the Australian people, who are very smart indeed? Thank you.
Well, goodness me, I think the first question will be left to the constitutional experts here as to what powers, limited that they are, the Governor-General has to intervene simply because the perception by some is that the country is being badly run. So I think it would be beneficial if those who are constitutional experts answer that question.
The two great examples of vice-regal power being exercised to dismiss the head of government was Jack Lang in 1932, Sir Philip Game. Lang was acting unlawfully and proposing to continue acting unlawfully, and that justified Game in acting. In Kerr and Whitlam was proposing to govern without supply, which strikes at the root of parliamentary power. Kerr was justified in acting to ensure that Parliament would have control over the executive through the provision of supply, which Fraser was able to guarantee. There's no such situation at the moment in Australia, I don't believe, either for the Governor-General or the governors of the states. There's no clear evidence that the executive government is acting unlawfully and supply has been guaranteed.
That's the key point, isn't it? It's whether it is unlawful. I mean, the indifference that these people seem to exercise is something that's got to be solved by the electorate. The trouble is, of course, many would argue that they're equally bad. That's the difficulty. I mean, basically, our parties have come, particularly under Morrison, have come so close together that people have very limited choice. And I suspect that what we've seen in the Sidcup Bexley by-election at the weekend in Britain is likely to be transplanted here. I mean, there was a seat, it was the death of a member of the House of Commons, not Patterson, who was forced to resign, but a death of a member, and Rocket Sheeran. At the end of the day, the turnout was 34%, and the margin of 29,000, which the Conservatives had, was reduced to a bare majority, but only 34% turned up. This is the disillusionment that people have got, feel about the political process. It's not speaking for the people, but who is? That's the key. And indeed, without injecting a highly personal minute, David alluded to Peter being the member for Wentworth. Peter King was removed, an outstanding member, and you've heard today the kind of person he is, in a massive branch stack in Wentworth, which of course the other side would call a branch renewal. And the General Secretary of the Liberal Party at the time, who turned a blind eye, was one Scott Morrison. So this is the problem. You know, the problems we face, Will, are endemic. It's good that there are people like you who are articulate about it and informed, but they are endemic problems, and we've just got to get into the public place and prosecute you, get into the ring, and be unafraid to take the case up. The second question was, so that's, and Ken answered that first business about the unlawful nature of the government's behaviour, therefore there's no capacity to intervene. The second half of your question was what? The second question was?
Well, there were, now in the polls, the essential poll, the Australian Republican movement put a private submission to essential polling saying we want to change the question from should Australia become a republic to should Australia become a republic and have an Australian head of state, which shifts the vote to the Republican side much more, even though the Australian head of state is the Governor General in the 91st High Court. So
Yes,
it's
well,
just cheating, in my opinion.
I honestly don't think, I think on the level, Will, you can rest comfortably tonight on the level of priorities in the minds of Australian people, that would be number 1,936, I can assure you.
And can I just add that, David, I saw Will's question as really as a plea to our parliamentarians to start standing up and become and make the bureaucracy, make the executive more accountable than it has. And the current emergency, and I congratulate you on your topic for this conference, David. The current emergency has stressed how important that is, and having regard to the figures that Alan's just mentioned, how disillusioned many ordinary people are in the political process at the moment. The question that you've asked, Will, is at the heart of those concerns.
One of the things that the Liberal Party politicians are being criticised for is the disruption in Canberra, because some Liberals have decided to exercise their consciences and cross the floor. I would have thought that we should be rejoicing that politicians are exercising their judgment and not just doing what they're told to do. Ken, you wanted to say something?
Yes, on the question of head of state, the Republicans have a blind spot. The case they took to the referendum in 1999 involves striking out from the Constitution reference to Governor-General and putting in the word President. The other change was the source of the President's appointment. Instead of the Crown, it was going to be Parliament. The power of appointment doesn't identify the head of state. You couldn't possibly say that Parliament was the head of state if the referendum had passed. The Queen is not the head of state just because she appoints the Governor-General. The Republican model did not involve any change in the Governor-General's powers. Just to strike out Governor-General and put in President. So they never explained why the President exercising those powers was the head of state and the Governor-General exercising those powers wasn't. The fact is, in either case, in both cases, the President and the Governor-General would be head of state. The Parliament appointing the President would not be the head of state, nor is the Queen the head of state because she appoints the President. All the executive powers are vested in the Governor-General, would be passed on to the President. So, at the heart of their case in 1999 was that the Governor-General was the head of state, because the President would be if the referendum had passed.
I must say, on the downside, in my view, David, I don't think much of this has been helped by the intervention of Prince Charles at Glasgow and all that stuff. I mean, that I think is a very hammer blow to the cause, the stability that we've enjoyed, I really think, and that's deep water in my opinion.
Let's hope there are no more COPs in the United Kingdom. Good.
I want the next one to come here.
Now, Daniel has asked for two things. Firstly, he wishes to ask his own question. The second thing is he wants to compromise you three gentlemen, by having me and the two ambassadors stand behind you and be photographed for the record.
Oh.
Of course, why
But
not?
so the question first, Daniel.
As it should be, as it should be.
Well, my question was...
Yes, come to
My
your
question,
photograph.
yeah. Well, my question was actually, now you've pointed it out about Prince Charles, and I wanted to know not only the panel's opinion but also the audience's opinions on the Prince of Wales' intervention in political ideas and of climate change, and what can we do about it? And
Apart from the fact that he's wrong, that's the first thing. But the intervention, I mean, he's been badly advised. Whether this is now part of the new modernisation and so on, and getting with it, I don't know. But it would be far better if he stayed aside. That's the historical position that the monarchy have always occupied, and that's the least of my objections. The most significant one is that on almost every point he keeps talking to plants and things, and I think he's completely wrong in the position he takes. I have no doubt, though, that were he to become king, there would be some very significant advice to steer him away from that sort of stuff.
does anybody else want
Yes.
to comment on that?
Yes, Warwick.
Lots.
I have a question, if I may.
Perhaps first, before you ask the question, perhaps
I know
any
there's
more
some people over there that wanted to talk. Did you want to come up and ask? Yeah, well, why not? Come up.
That's so you appear on the record.
I'm Jennifer Lawson, and I ran the polling booth in Randwick for the No Republic Day back in 1999. And it's wonderful to be in such great company. Just a comment on Prince Charles. I read his book called Harmony, which was published many years ago, and there are a lot of really wonderful, spiritual and very sensible ideas expressed in that book. And he has intervened in politics in political areas in the UK in lots of ways. They call him was the spider writings. He would stand up for injustices in local communities, and he did lots of productive things with the Prince's Trust, like restoring Dumfries House and that kind of thing. It's only a kind of a gut feeling opinion that I think, because he has always supported common sense aspects of the environment, I think he might, like Alan suggested, be influenced to take on board this concept about global warming. And I just recently listened to a speech, was it Anne Bessington, who was talking at the Lord Monckton speech, and she reminded me about the Agenda 21, which is taking, you've mentioned so adeptly pointing out all the issues of the day, but we have to take a little step further to the global influences, and that's what the Agenda 21 and the Lima Declaration was all about. And we are required to go and study those documents, because that is underpinning what's happening today. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, that's called the Great Reset, and there's no doubt that there is a determination amongst some. I mean, what has been completely ignored about Glasgow is that most of the ridiculous resolutions that were taken there by Boris Johnson and the cognitively deficient Joe Biden came to nothing. But when those leaders departed, the most significant resolution was a resolution by this fellow who had been the governor of the Reserve Bank, the governor of the Bank of England, Carney, who pulled together major financial institutions with assets worth $130 trillion, T for trillion dollars, to argue that what conferences such as COP weren't able to achieve, the financial institutions would be able to secure the proper end result. What that would mean, to put it in simple terms, is that the farmer at one where Peter lives, Uralla and these places, would want $100,000 from the bank for a tractor, and the bank would ask him what he was doing about carbon dioxide offsets, and if he couldn't validate any of that, he wouldn't get the $100,000. Now, once financial instruments start behaving in this way, this is a national economic suicide note, and no one has addressed this here in Australia yet. No one even has acknowledged that it occurred, but it's in place. There are a lot of assets, 130 trillion. So this is the other side of this stuff, and it's just part of the overall picture. It is called the Great Reset, to change the whole nature of the way in which democracies have functioned and have operated, to be governed by powers and forces beyond our borders, and you'd want a decent leader to stand up to that, but we haven't had one since Abbott.
I was speaking to Tony Abbott about this, and he speaks very highly of Prince Charles. But I was thinking about Prince Charles, and I suppose just speaking as a devil's advocate in his defence, I suspect he doesn't see this as a political issue. He sees this as a question of science. I think he's wrong, but he sees it as a question of science. Now, he's helped by that, by the fact that every Prime Minister of every realm and every leader of the opposition of every realm is wedded to this climate ideology. So, to an extent, it's our fault, because if we feel objection to the position which our Prime Minister has just taken strongly, and our leader of the opposition takes, well, we don't have to vote for them. And the same in the United Kingdom. We can change governments if we really wish to. And the other thing, I was talking to Tony, I said, oh, by the way, since you're advising them all the time on trade, is it about time they made you a minister? And he said, how would they do that? And I said, well, it's quite simple. You just become Lord Abbot of Warringah. And I said, there's a precedent. One of the boys from my school he's a great scientist, became president of the Law Society. And they were going to make him Lord Mayor of Wallara. That was the name he asked for, but the Howard government said that he couldn't be called Lord Mayor of Wallara, so he had to choose an English name for his place name. So Tony's back, still advising the British government. I suspect I've dropped a germ of an idea in his head.
Well, I asked on radio a leading political figure in this country, who will remain unnamed, a leading political figure, if carbon dioxide is a problem, apparently it's a problem, what percentage of carbon dioxide exists in the atmosphere? That person had no idea. Now, if carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is 0.04%, it must be a pretty lethal gas, and of that 0.04%, 83% is created by human beings around the world, and of the 3% of 0.04%, 1.3% is created by Australia. What are we doing? What's all this about? But you see, none of these people read, none of them listen to major authorities anywhere at all. They swallow the latest jargon, and they all fall into line. They're not leaders, they're followers, and the consequences are with us. And here we are. I mean, a bloke was driving, pulled up yesterday to speak to me in a Mercedes-Benz car, and I said, well, how long do you think you'll have this for? Well, what do you mean? Well, I said, these things are built with metallurgical coal. We've got the best metallurgical coal in the Hunter Valley, according to that mob over in Glasgow. That's going to be obliterated. We're going to demonise metallurgical coal, so all this heavy industries will be done for, unless you're going to find some other way of substituting. But none of this is considered, none of it's debated. And see, one of the weaknesses, David, I think, and Peter, you've been inside this, of the democratic process, there is no debate in the Parliament. One person stands up and talks nonsense, anyone interjects, he gets thrown out, and then the bloke on the other side stands up and talks nonsense. It's recorded in Hansard, which no one reads. So the notion, whereas at least in the House of Commons at parliamentary question time, they give way. So someone can be answering a question, and a hand goes up, I give way to the honourable member, and that honourable member will challenge and criticise what is being said. But we don't have this kind of debate here, and forums like this are very rare. So, and of course in current affairs now on TV and everywhere, no one's going to have an opinion because you'll be cancelled, so it's all sort of reality TV stuff. And the impoverishment, intellectual impoverishment of the nation just continues on.
But Alan, that's called totalitarianism, isn't it?
It is.
And
Not
I
far
think
off.
I just finished my question or comment on that point, because Alan's mentioned two things. One, he was saying, well, we have been dumbed down, and that's been a deliberate thing over the last, I've noticed it the last 40 years. So people's ability to question things, critical thinking, has not encouraged. But the other thing, Alan, you said that I take great courage in and inspiration is the essence of the Australian people. Saturday before last, 1 million people came out into the streets to speak their voice. They debated with their bodies, took the transport, mums, dads, children's, people from all nationalities. They were out there in the streets. 1 million people in Australia were out there, and they're going to continue to come out there to speak because the politicians are not speaking the truth. People are learning through social media about Agenda 21 and the global reset. So it's not just our own politicians that are letting us down. They're being influenced and bribed and corrupted by this global event. And I think that's, if we can take today into that level, we'll find solutions. And let's see if we can, the people will speak and hopefully some new leaders will come out of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we have, thank you very much. We have three things before firstly we have a question from Daniel, a question from Warwick. Daniel.
No more questions from me.
Warwick.
Thank you, gentlemen. It was a very interesting cornucopia of matters. So due process, those experts, Alan, that you referred to, Section 51, 23A, and Menzies putting in the no conscription, which is very comforting to know. Also leadership. There's been a complete failure of leadership in this country at the federal level and also at the state level. The bureaucrats have taken control, as has been mentioned. And the thing about the medical bureaucrats, of course, just to paraphrase something that was said to me some years ago about medical bureaucrats or one particular part of medicine, you can't fail if you go into medical bureaucracy because you already have failed in medicine. And this...
That's being an academic.
This is the case. And of course, so we've seen this. And also you touched on education, Alan, and there's so many things I could say about that. In fact, just one quick thing I'd like to say. ACARA, the Australian Curriculum Board that has been in the news recently because of its demonisation to a certain extent of Western civilization and our Judeo-Christian heritage, which I would argue actually hasn't been taught properly in high schools probably for the last 30 or 40 years. And it's being replaced with Aboriginal spiritualism and physics, astronomy, democracy, and all those other wonderful things that were invented by our Aboriginal brothers. But I'm interested in languages, and I looked at the draft curriculum in languages, and one of the points that was made was that over 25 years, they have negotiated the languages curriculum. 25 years, that's 4 generations of high school students who've been failed while these career bureaucrats earned their living over 25 years. Another comment I just saw recently was we've wrestled for 40 years over something to do with languages. So these are the bureaucrats that are running us. The question I have to ask is, the point was made about the live cattle trade and Minister Ludwig and the massive damages that are going to be paid by taxpayers, not by the decision makers. And I would like to ask, is there any way that, and I appreciate in leadership, and we haven't seen leadership, but decisions have to be made in leadership, and most decisions should be made in good faith, and where they are made in good faith, one can't come back afterwards and say that was wrong. But where decisions are made off the cuff, without due process, without following the legislation and so on, why cannot penalties be brought against the ministers, and in a way that does not prevent them from making decisions in good faith on very serious matters? And just one final point. You will no doubt all remember the Red Shirt affair in Victoria, where the Labor Party, Dan Andrews, was found guilty, or was accused certainly, of misuse of public funds. The Labor Party paid back over $300,000. It was misused by the Labor Party, but the Labor politicians refused to cooperate with the investigators, and as a result, no charges, no further investigations have been done. In other words, these people have just ignored the law and got away with it. What can be done about that?
Well, I could answer that pretty simply. It's the age-old problem, isn't it? If you're seeking penalties, then they must be most probably would have to be legislated for, and no politician is going to vote for a system of penalty where he might be the first victim, except Berejiklian, of course, when I warned her 1,000 times that she might be the latest victim, not knowing that she was involved in anything, of ICAC. Therefore, the act ought to be changed. She persisted in not changing it, and now she's its ultimate victim. But in all of these things, you see, this is the point. I mean, if you thought, for example, that an upper house was far too expensive and too indulgent, then to get rid of it, you have to sort of legislate to make it happen. No person's going to legislate themselves out of a job. No politician's going to legislate themselves into a situation where they may be the next victim of a penal system that they voted for. So it's very difficult. I appreciate what you say, and I mean the live cattle export is classic, but it's not the only one. I mean, what kind of damage has been done to children, and who should suffer a penalty as a result of that? I mean, the kids can't see their friends, can't have an overnight sleep, grandparents can't meet their babies. So as the baby eventually to maybe 2 or 3 months old, and the grandparents are foreigners. There are a whole heap of psychological and emotional, let alone social or economic consequences of what we've been through. And common sense would tell you someone ought to have to be punished for this, but they won't be. The system doesn't allow it. That's the tragedy. Peter?
Look, I think you've really covered it all, Alan. There are some provisions which are what are called civil penalty provisions in the Corporations Act and so on. But that also requires ASIC and APRA to actually gird up their loins and bring the prosecutions. And ASIC's proved pretty lackadaisical in the past. They're improving a little bit. So, in short, there are both civil damages provisions which ordinary people can bring, and prosecutors can bring such claims against some members of the executive, but it doesn't happen very often.
No, and so you talked about languages. I mean, I agree with you entirely. But you see, the federal government is responsible for a national curriculum, but the federal government doesn't employ a teacher. The federal government doesn't employ a nurse. So these things then are passed back, funding's provided. I mean, what Morrison, I believe, should have done to Andrews over lockdowns and the serious and damaging consequences of that would be say, I'm not going to tell you what to do. You must please yourself, but I'll tell you what I'll do. There won't be money. There won't be taxpayers' money coming from Canberra if this kind of behaviour continues. That's what I'm telling you. You please yourself, but I will be instructing my government hasn't got the guts to do it. But that was the ultimate sanction. They've got the purse strings, and this should have been and people will be out there cheering from the rooftops about this. Now, the curriculum is classic. What you're saying, it's just been completely bastardised, whether it's you're talking about English literature or languages or mathematics or science. It's lowest common denominator stuff, and where that occurs, who's being betrayed? The leaders of tomorrow. We're miles behind the rest of the world. So it's a very, very good question, which doesn't admit of a very easy answer.
2 points. One, in the live cattle trade case, Ludwig was not a defendant in the case, the Commonwealth was. So the case could never have brought any personal liability on Ludwig. Point 2, there's a Workplace Safety Act in Victoria which imposes very drastic criminal penalties on directors and other people responsible for workplace safety. There's been a prosecution arising out of the deaths in the aged care homes in Victoria. The defendant is the Department of Health. Not the bureaucrats, not the Minister, not the Premier, the Department of Health. Any fine imposed will just go from one pocket in the budget to another pocket in the same budget.
Yeah, Ken's point, that's a very, very valid point you make there. That Workplace Safety Act in Victoria was introduced, it's very draconian, introduced by Andrews, designed to catch out big business who may be found guilty of bad payment or mistreatment of whatever employees, with a consequence on their physical well-being and ultimately their death. This was designed to trap these people, but now it's the government itself, through its maladministration, is responsible for 800 deaths, and the legislation specifically says that ministers are not exempt from sanctions under the Act. But however, who's to bring about the prosecution? There was the Coate inquiry, found that basically no one, oh, we just don't know. People didn't even appear. People kept on saying 97 times, I can't remember, I'm not sure. There were no definitive answers given, and that's all disappeared. And where's the opposition? The only bloke that took any bark off them down there was the fellow who stupidly had too many drinks one night and ran and pranked his car. And straight away, what happens? Well, the Labor Party says he's got to go, and his own party says he's got to go. So the Labor Party are clapping their hands. The one person that was capable of leading the charge and being aggressive, instead of saying, look, OK, he's done the wrong thing, he'll be demoted, he'll have to pay his time out here away from executive office, but he'll be not going anywhere. Leave the bloke there, he's now out of politics, and so the opposition is silent. But that Work Safety Act, I must go back to that, that's absolutely right. And it's very, very significant. And the penal clauses are very, very severe, but designed to catch, as I said, the corporate world, and now, indeed, Andrews himself ought to be caught in it, but who's going to raise the prosecution?
Well, Fair Work Australia.
I'm sorry. The person who's heading it is the former head of staff of Stephen Brax's office. So Paul Keating once said to me, Alan, they'll get rid of me. I'll tell you something. I'll have all my people in the right places. and serious. And that's how it happens.
Yes. Minister Ludwig was found to have committed the civil offence of misfeasance in public office, for which the Commonwealth was responsible. They were the defendants in the case. I made a suggestion in an opinion piece I wrote that there should be a criminal offence of serious misfeasance in public office, and that the person responsible should be criminally responsible, which, of course, it does require the politicians to introduce that, does it not?